A few weeks had passed since my wife and I had decided to end our marriage. At first glance, nothing had changed. We still ate dinner together, discussed everyday matters, and laughed at our son's jokes. But there was a new flavor in the air, a flavor of freedom that at first made my head spin. At first, I felt as if I had broken out of a prison cell in which I had spent many years. The world outside its walls turned out to be bright, inviting, full of possibilities. I began to notice how women looked at me in cafes, at the gym, even in the office. These glances, which had previously had no meaning, now took on new meaning. I was no longer bound by the rigid framework of marriage. I was free. One evening when my wife went out on her first date, she called it that, avoiding more specific words, I stayed home trying not to think about what she was doing. To distract myself, I decided to go out. I went to a bar I hadn't been to for a long time. The place was half empty, so I sat down at the counter and ordered a whiskey. My head was spinning with thoughts about my wife, about our decision, about the fact that we had started to build something new, but we didn't know where it would lead. After a while, a woman approached the counter. She had a slender figure, confident movements, and a keen gaze. She glanced quickly in my direction, and I noticed a slight smile on her lips. Her confidence and elusive mystery attracted me, and I felt a strange excitement that I hadn't felt for a long time. A lonely evening? Her voice was unexpectedly soft and enveloping. Looks like it, I answered, feeling how the alcohol slightly warmed my body and weakened my internal barriers. I'm bored too, she said, sitting down on the chair next to me. Maybe we should keep each other company? I nodded, and our conversation began as if we were old friends. Her name was Laura, and she was an interesting conversationalist, but I felt that there was something else behind her words, something she was not yet ready to tell. There was that sparkle in her eyes that people get when they are looking for something new that can change their lives for the better. A few drinks later, when the atmosphere in the bar became more relaxed, Laura suggested a walk. We went outside, and the night air pleasantly cooled our skin. She walked next to me, sometimes her hand touched mine, and this touch sent goosebumps down my body. We reached her car, and she turned to me and suggested that we continue the evening at her place. I knew where this could lead, and I understood that this would be the first step into a new, unknown world. I accepted her offer and we went to her house. Her apartment was cozy, with soft lighting and warm colors. Laura offered me a drink, but I declined. I was already feeling a little dizzy. She smiled and came closer. Her movements were smooth and confident. I felt my insides tighten as she touched my hand and then her lips. We found ourselves in her bedroom, and at that moment I was completely immersed in the sensations. Laura was gentle, but there was passion in her touch. For a moment, I forgot about everything, about my wife, about our agreement, about the world outside this room. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, but deep inside, something continued to gnaw at me from within. In the morning, I woke up in her bed, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Laura was still asleep, her breathing even and calm. I got up quietly, got dressed and left the apartment, trying not to wake her. When I was outside, the morning air refreshed my thoughts, but the inner feeling of anxiety did not go away. Returning home, I could not stop thinking about what had happened. On the one hand, I experienced something new, something exciting, but on the other hand, there was emptiness inside. It was like a breath of fresh air, followed by a suffocating feeling of guilt. When I opened the door of our house, I immediately felt that something had changed. His wife was sitting in the kitchen, her face was tense and her eyes were tired. I realized that she had also recently returned and, perhaps, also spent the night away from home. But we remained silent, avoiding discussing what had happened. This silence was like an abyss that was becoming wider and wider between us. I spent the next few days thinking. I went to see Laura more and more often, trying to forget myself in her company, but each time I felt only a growing emptiness. My wife also began to spend less and less time at home, and I did not ask unnecessary questions, although inside everything was bursting with curiosity and jealousy. One evening when I returned home, she was already gone. I went to the bedroom and saw the ring she had left on the bedside table. It was there, like a reminder of what we had lost a long time ago. I picked it up, and at that moment it occurred to me that the experiment in which we both participated was beginning to destroy us from the inside. I sat on the edge of the bed looking at the ring, and something inside me broke. The freedom that had seemed so tempting turned into the bitterness of loneliness. I thought that my wife was probably spending time with someone else, and this caused a new wave of jealousy in me. But what could I say? We had both agreed to this path, and now every step led us further into alienation. The next day I met Laura, but this time something was wrong. She sensed it too. Our conversations became tense and our touches became mechanical. I tried to regain that feeling of freedom and ease that I had at the beginning, but it was gone. Laura noticed it first. "You've changed," she said one day, looking at me suspiciously. "Is something wrong?" I shook my head, not knowing how to explain it. I wanted to leave her, but I didn't know how to tell her about it. Our meetings became rare and then stopped altogether. Laura left as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving behind only memories and a feeling of emptiness. I returned to my old life, but everything was no longer the same. My wife became even more distant, her meetings continued, and I no longer tried to find out who she was spending time with. We became like two strangers living under the same roof. Our freedom turned out to be a prison from which there was no escape. And although we still maintained the appearance of a family for the sake of my son, every evening returning home, I felt something inside me crumbling. The freedom we sought turned into an illusion, behind which the bitterness of loneliness hid. But I could not just give up. Deep down I began to hatch a plan. This plan was supposed to protect me and my son from the devastating consequences of our decisions. I understood that there was no turning back, and the only way out was to move forward, no matter how difficult it was. After that night with Laura, everything changed. I returned home, but now the feeling of emptiness and alienation was unbearable. His wife, as usual, was in the kitchen, but this time her face looked even more tired and tense. We still avoided talking about what was happening in our lives. A silence fell between us, destroying any remnants of intimacy. The next day I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept returning to what had happened. I couldn't get the image of Laura out of my head, but at the same time I was haunted by the thought that my wife might have been with someone else too. Jealousy and fear mixed with guilt, and I didn't know how to cope with these emotions. When I got home, my wife was sitting at the table with her head down. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the ring on the nightstand that she had taken off the day our lives began to fall apart. "We need to talk," she said in a quiet but determined voice. I sat down across from him, feeling my insides tighten. She looked up, and I saw the pain in them that she was trying to hide. "How did we get to this? What happened?" she asked quietly, her voice shaking. "When did it all go wrong?" The question was rhetorical, but it struck me like lightning. I had wondered about it too, but I couldn't find an answer. It had all started out so well. We were young, full of hope and love. Our days were filled with laughter and our nights with passion. But time had changed us, and as the years went by, it seemed like there were fewer and fewer things that connected us. "I don't know," I answered honestly, meeting her gaze. "Maybe we just lost each other." She nodded, and sadness flickered in her eyes. "I've been thinking about it for a long time," she continued, avoiding my gaze, "about what we should do to fix this. And the only thing that comes to mind is to give each other freedom." These words made me tense up. I knew where she was going with this. We had discussed the possibility of an open marriage before, but back then it was more theory than reality. Now that we had both begun to act within the framework of this agreement, it became obvious that it was far from a salvation. "Do you think this is the solution?" I asked, trying to hide my inner tension. "I'm not sure," she answered, looking at the ring in her hands. "But maybe this is the only way to save what we have. If we give each other the opportunity to look for happiness elsewhere, maybe it will help us find ourselves." I didn't know what to say. This time her words sounded not like a request, but like a statement of fact. We had already started this journey, and now it seemed there was no turning back. "We can try," I finally said, realizing that any other solution would lead to even more destruction. "But we have to have rules. We can't just let things slide." She nodded in agreement. "I know. We've already discussed this. No close friends, no visits at home, no discussions of our relationship with other people. We will be careful that this does not harm our son." The words felt right, but everything inside me protested against this idea. However, I understood that perhaps this really was the only way to keep the family together, even if it meant that we would become strangers to each other. "Okay," I answered, feeling anxiety growing in my chest. "Then let's try." She placed the ring on the bedside table as if giving it to fate. We sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, realizing that we had taken a step down a path from which there was no return. Our lives had changed, and now we could only hope that this would not lead us to complete destruction. That night we slept in the same bed, but now it was just a formality. I lay in the dark, listening to her even breathing, and thought about how we had come to this. Memories of a past life, when everything was simple and clear, now seemed distant and intangible. We were looking for freedom, but found only an abyss that separated us further and further. The next day we returned to our usual activities, trying not to think about what was happening. But something new was beginning to form inside me, the understanding that our lives would never be the same again. We were about to embark on a long journey into something unknown, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. A few months had passed since my wife and I had begun experimenting with an open marriage. Life went on, but I felt like everything I had thought was familiar and secure was slowly crumbling. I continued to go to work and see Laura, but inside I felt like there was an emptiness that nothing could fill. With each passing day, I felt more and more distant from my wife and from myself. On the outside, everything looked calm. Our son Nick continued to delight us with his successes in school, my wife continued to do housework, and I dutifully performed my duties at work. But behind these appearances there was something much darker and more destructive. One evening when I returned home, I was greeted by an oppressive silence. My wife wasn't there, and I realized she'd gone back to her meeting. I took off my jacket, threw it casually over the back of a chair, and headed for the kitchen, where I had a pre-cooked meal waiting in the refrigerator, which I'd heated up in the microwave. Everything was happening mechanically, mindlessly, as if I wasn't in my body but was observing myself from the outside. While I was eating, my thoughts wandered. I remembered the passion that once connected me with my wife, our closeness. Now there was no trace left of it. We lived together, but we were so far from each other that it seemed as if kilometers separated us, and not the walls of our house. After dinner, I decided to go for a walk. It was unbearable to stay in an empty house. I went outside and headed towards the park. The night was warm and the fresh air slightly burned my skin. Passing people, I noticed their smiles, heard their laughter, but inside everything was shrinking from loneliness. There was a lot of life around, but I felt cut off from it. I found an empty bench and sat down, immersed in my thoughts. There was no clarity in my head, just mush. Everything that had happened in the past months seemed like some kind of absurd dream from which I could not wake up. I was tormented by the thought that I had lost not only my wife, but also myself. Suddenly, I felt that I could no longer sit still. Something had to change. The next day, I decided to take a day off and leave the city. I wanted to be alone, away from everything that reminded me of my failure. I told my wife that I was going to a business meeting, and she nodded without asking any questions. It was like our new relationship. We lived in denial, as if we were afraid that any unnecessary word would destroy the remains of our family. I chose a small village in the mountains where my wife and I usually spent weekends. At that time, this place had been a symbol of peace and happiness for us, but now I hoped that it would help me find answers to the questions that tormented me. On the way, I stopped at a roadside cafe. It was empty inside, except for an elderly man behind the counter, who was looking out the window as if waiting for someone. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the raindrops begin to fall from the gray sky. I didn't expect to see anyone I knew there, but when the door opened and Laura walked into the cafe, I felt my insides tense up. She looked around, noticed me, and came over to my table. I didn't know if I was happy to see her or if it would make me feel worse. "Hi," she said, sitting down across from him. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Me either," I replied, trying to hide my confusion. "I decided to take a break from the hustle and bustle of the city." She nodded, her eyes tired, but still holding that confidence that had once attracted me so much. "Are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head to the side. The question made me think. I was far from okay, but I didn't want to admit it. Laura seemed to read my mind. "You know, sometimes I feel like we're all just running from something, but no one knows what it is," she continued, looking into her cup. "Maybe," I said, feeling that her words had hit the mark. "But you can't run away from yourself." Laura looked at me with understanding, and in that moment I realized that she felt the same way as I did. Everything that had seemed interesting and exciting to us at first now seemed empty and meaningless. Why did we decide that an open marriage would help us? "What is it?" I asked unexpectedly, not expecting such a revelation from myself. Laura thought for a moment, her fingers sliding along the rim of her cup. "I think we were all looking for something new that would give us back the sense of life that we had lost," she said quietly. "But instead we lost even more." I was silent, realizing how true her words were. Everything I was looking for seemed out of reach. Now that I saw Laura in front of me, I realized that our relationship could not fill the emptiness that had formed inside me either. "Laura," he began, looking at her seriously, "I can't do this anymore. I need to change something." She nodded, her face was sad, but there was no offense or reproach in her eyes. "I understand," she said softly. "Maybe we both need something else." We sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Then Laura stood up, came up to me and lightly touched my hand. "Take care of yourself," she said, and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat in the cafe for a few more minutes and then decided to leave too. My trip to the village had lost its meaning. Returning home, I felt even more alone than before. Everything I tried to find turned out to be just an illusion, and now I needed to figure out how to live on. When I returned home, my wife was sitting on the sofa with a book in her hands. She looked up, saw me, and without saying a word, plunged into reading again. I walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, my stomach clenching in despair. Our lives had become a series of empty actions, devoid of meaning and emotion. That night I couldn't sleep for a long time. I lay in bed, listening to the silence of the house, and wondered how we had gotten to this point. Memories of a past life, when everything was simple and clear, now seemed distant and intangible. We had sought freedom, but in the crowd we found only loneliness. The next day I decided to talk to my wife. I knew it could change everything, but I couldn't live like this any longer. That evening, when Nick had gone to see his friends, I approached her. "We need to talk," I began, feeling my insides tighten with tension. She looked up from her book, her face calm, but I saw something new in her gaze, something that made me tense up. "About what?" she asked, putting the book aside. "About us," I answered, struggling to find the words. "About how we live." She was silent, but I could see that she understood what I was talking about. "We've become strangers," I said, trying to express everything that had accumulated over these months. "I can't do this anymore. We wanted freedom, but this is not what I expected. We lost each other, and I don't know how to get it back." My wife looked at me, her eyes shining, but there were no tears in sight. She was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "I know. I feel the same. But what can we do? We have already made this decision. There is no turning back." I knew she was right. We had gone too far, and now we could only move forward, trying to find some way out. But deep down, I knew that our paths had already diverged, and no amount of talking would bring back what we had lost. We sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, realizing that our lives had changed forever. Perhaps we needed to find a new path, but right now we were too tired to look for it. We could only hope that time would give us the answers we so desperately sought. A strong wind raged outside, driving dry leaves along the sidewalks as if playing some cruel game. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Everything seemed especially depressing that evening. My son was visiting friends, and we found ourselves alone again in an empty house that had once been filled with life and laughter. My wife sat across from me, her face tense and her eyes thoughtful. She held a cup of cold tea in her hands, but she didn't seem to notice. I was silent too, collecting my thoughts. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer and started a conversation. "We can't do this anymore," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "We both know that." She didn't answer, but I saw her hands tighten around the cup. Over the months, despite all our efforts, something had changed irreversibly. The gap between us had only widened, and now it seemed impossible to bridge it. "You're right," she finally said without looking up. "But what can we do?" Her voice was quiet, almost lifeless. It was not the tone I had known before, when her words always sounded confident. Now, sitting before me was a woman who had lost not only herself, but everything she held dear. I think we should end this," I said, feeling my insides tighten. "An open marriage was a mistake. We both tried to find something new, but we ended up losing everything." She looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Are you saying that we should break up?" I nodded, even though everything inside me resisted the decision. But I knew it was the only way. "I don't want to break up our family, but we need to find a way to move on. Maybe apart." She put her cup down and looked at me with a pain and sadness that was too obvious to ignore. "I don't know if I can live without you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Neither do I," I replied, feeling a heaviness growing in my chest. "But we've already lost each other. We need to move on or we'll completely destroy everything we had." She was silent, but I could see that she realized the truth of my words. It was a decision she had been trying to make for herself, but she couldn't find the strength to make. I stood up and went to the window, looking out at the storm raging outside the house. It was like the chaos that was happening inside us. "I agree," she said suddenly, her voice stronger than before. "We have to end this before it's too late." I turned around, meeting her gaze, and saw in her eyes the same despair that I felt. "Then let's do it right," I suggested, sitting down across from her. "We'll talk to Nick, explain everything to him. We'll try to make sure he doesn't get hurt. And then we'll just go our separate ways." She nodded, and in that moment I knew that our decision was inevitable. We both knew there was no other way. The next day we gathered Nick in the living room and explained our decision to him. He listened to us with a serious face without interrupting. I saw how his eyes moved from one to the other, but he did not ask a single question. When we finished, he asked quietly, "Are you getting a divorce?" His voice was full of fear, but I tried to explain it to him as gently as possible. "We don't want to hurt you, Nick. We just realized that we can't be happy together. But that doesn't mean we don't love you." He didn't answer, but I saw his eyes fill with tears. We hugged him, trying to let him know that he was still important to both of us, no matter what happened. A few weeks passed before we filed for divorce. Those weeks were the hardest in my life. We lived under the same roof, but each day separated us more and more. Every morning I woke up with the thought that soon it would all be over, and this thought brought relief and pain at the same time. Finally, the day came when we signed the documents. I remember holding the pen over the papers, feeling its weight as if it was not a pen, but a stamp that put an end to our story. My wife stood next to me, her face stony, but I knew that inside her raged the same storm as mine. When it was all over, we walked out courthouse and headed for the car. Nick stayed home, not wanting to be a part of this process. We were silent, not knowing what to say. At some point, I stopped and turned to her. "We did everything we could," I said quietly, trying to contain my emotions. "Now we have a chance to start over, each in our own way." She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the same pain I was feeling. "Yes," she whispered. "I hope we find what we're looking for." We stood there for a few moments, looking at each other like two people who had once been close but now found themselves on opposite sides of a river that could no longer be crossed. Then she turned and walked toward the car. I watched her go, knowing that this was our last moment together, and perhaps the last time we would see each other like this. When she left, I stood in the street, feeling empty inside. The wind died down and a strange silence fell. I returned home, feeling the silence spreading through the rooms, like an old friend who had come to visit. But at the moment when I sat down on the sofa and felt a wave of loneliness wash over me, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised, but I went to answer it anyway. Laura was standing in the doorway, her face worried. "You won't believe what I found," she said, and a spark of excitement flashed in her eyes. "Laura? What are you doing here?" I asked, feeling my fatigue recede into the background. I couldn't help but tell you about this. You should know." Her voice was tense. I let her in, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. Laura took some documents out of her bag and handed them to me. I quickly scanned the pages and everything inside me turned over. This is impossible," I breathed out, barely believing my eyes. "But it's true," Laura insisted. "I did my research and it all came together. Your wife, she had been planning all along to end the marriage and take everything she could with her. This open marriage was just a cover for preparing documents and registering all the property in his name." I couldn't believe my ears. Inside, everything boiled with anger and despair. Everything my wife and I had built was a lie. She used me to carry out her plan, and now I was left with nothing. But looking at Laura, I realized that now I had the opportunity to change everything. I didn't know how to do it, but the instinct for self-preservation woke up in me. I realized that I could no longer be a victim. This new life I was about to start was not at all what I had imagined, but I still had a chance to restore justice. "Thank you, Laura," I said, meeting her gaze. "You've helped me a lot. Now I know what to do." We both knew that this was not the end, but only the beginning of a new path. I didn't know where it would lead, but I was ready to go to the end. Determination flared up in me, and I realized that this new life would be completely different from what I expected, but it turned out to be even better. We stood by the window looking at the night city, and I realized that now I was finally truly free. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.